All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Amanda Moreno, and I'm going to be talking on EA Zoom meetings today about non-monogamous relationship styles and astrology. And so I'll just kind of launch right in here. I'll go through an outline and all that, but first I just like to kind of give gratitude to the people whose ideas I'm kind of relying on in addition to my own. And so that would be Jeff Green. Rhea Wolf and Ian Weisler have been doing the Queer Astrology conference a couple times, and that's been incredibly helpful to the work that I do. I'll be using some of Patricia Walsh's material, and then a lot of material is from a book called Sex at Dawn, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And then just gratitude to the non-monogamous community in Seattle that is really freaking amazing. So I am a practicing astrologer, deep memory process practitioner, and my kind of like the general pulse that goes underneath all the work that I do is that I believe we're going through a collective rite of passage. And so I think it's really important for people to have spaces where they can process their stuff and get witnessed without judgment. And that kind of goes together with a main interest of mine, which is relationship styles, because I believe that the ways that we relate are going to be, or changing the ways that we relate to each other is going to be really imperative in kind of going into a more sustainable paradigm. So I identify as a queer person who practices non-monogamous relationships. Those are two of my kind of core identities. And the reason that I think that queerness kind of comes into play here is because, and let me just go to the next slide here, or the definition of terms. I'm bringing queer into this, which is a term that's oftentimes associated with the LGBTQ or the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community. But I think that queerness has a place here because it is essentially referring to anyone who doesn't conform to traditional norms, and especially in terms of sexual orientation, gender identity, and relationship structure. And queerness and astrology are really powerful partners together because astrologers tend to be outside the norm as well. And one of the gifts of astrology is that it helps people who are outsiders kind of orient to their experience in a way that is really personal and also collectively relevant. So that's why I bring those two things together. And if at any point somebody wants to jump in with questions, I'm fine with that too, but I will have space at the end for that as well. And we didn't really come up with an end time for this, so I'm aiming for like 60 to 75 minutes. So just basic outline, we're going to go through that definition of terms that I was just showing you. We're going to talk about kind of the evolution of the mythology of what natural human relationships look like. We're going to talk about the Pluto and Libra and Pluto and Scorpio generations. Partially because as I've started to do research into non-monogamous relationships and astrology, I've just needed to kind of narrow it down, and that's been one way to narrow it down. But also because, you know, really generally speaking, those two generations are more directly dealing with relationship karma and working through that. And so it's just kind of a natural lead point for that. We'll talk a bit about the research I've been doing just in terms of how the responses I've been getting from people kind of bring out what I would call the higher qualities of the Pluto polarity points for both of those generations. We'll talk a little bit about astrological correlations. And then if there is time, I will use my chart as an example. All right. So, definition of terms. All of these are completely fluid and relative. And one of the points that I'll just keep coming back to is the importance of, especially for counseling astrologers, really asking your clients what their definitions and their identity labels mean to them, because it's going to be really fluid and everybody's kind of different. And so open relationship is something that I use as kind of an umbrella term to refer to any relationship that is not sexually monogamous. Polyamory is a term that I think is getting more coverage in our culture, but it is essentially the state or practice of maintaining multiple sexual and or romantic relationships simultaneously. The key part being that it's with the full knowledge and consent of all the people involved. So full knowledge and consent, meaning everyone is aware and open to and accepting of what is going on. Ethical non-monogamy is kind of like the overarching bracket here that encompasses all the ways that you can consciously, with agreement, explore multiple loving and sexual relationships with multiple people. And then two, just kind of, definitions I thought I would throw in are just, I think that the kind of like media coverage that we're getting now in the mainstream is focusing primarily on married couples or established couples that are opening up their relationships and adding people, and there's kind of an implicit hierarchy in that structure, and in a lot of ways that's more palatable and it's easier to understand to the general public, but there's a lot going on that is outside of that model even. So solo polyamory is a label that some people use when they don't tend to have relationships that involve primary style merging of life infrastructure or identity, or like using the label of a primary partner. And so a lot of solo polyamorous folks will tell you that they are their own primary partner, for example. And then relationship anarchy is probably closest to where I am in my path right now in terms of how I try to, label my relationships when I do that at all. And so just a quote here is that a relationship anarchist begins from a place of assuming total freedom and flexibility as the one in charge of their personal relationships, and decides on a case-by-case basis what they want each relationship to look like. And there's just a little link there for you. And I'll have more links at the end if you want more resources and more information. So what non-monogamy is not, or what I'm not talking about today, is cheating. So again, there's an emphasis on consent and openness and awareness. It's also not the same thing as polygamy. So we're not focusing on a man who is having more than one wife. Okay, and there's, again, no value judgments there either. But that's not, I think that a lot of times people conflate those two things, or just assume that polyamory or non-monogamy is all about like the man having multiple women. I'm not talking about swinging either, although that's definitely included under the non-monogamous umbrella. And we're not referring to this as something that always starts from a primary relationship or a marriage. So I kind of talked about that one already. All right. So just to kind of like, cover a lot of ground here. One of the most accessible books that will talk to you about the kind of like anthropological, biological, sociological, and psychological origins of human relationship structures and sexuality is Sex at Dawn by Christopher Ryan. It does have its problems, but a lot of the book can be verified through other sources. And so its primary question is just, what is human sexuality and how did it get to be that way? So the quote that I have written here is, "The campaign to obscure the true nature of our species sexuality leaves half our marriages collapsing under an unstoppable tide of swirling sexual frustration." And I think that is getting at the fact that we tend to, a lot of people will say things like, oh, well, it's, part of human nature that we pair off in monogamous bonds. And a lot of what this book is talking about is the fact that that's not true. Time spent in agricultural societies, which is about the past 10,000 years, represents about 5% of our collective experience at most. And that's when we start to see monogamous pair bonding coming into the picture. So this book is kind of looking at how cultural shifts from about 10,000 years ago made the story of sexuality and human relationships, or the true story of sexuality and human relationships, so subversive and threatening that for centuries it's been silenced by our religions, by our doctors, by our scientists, and by our psychologists, all of whom tend to kind of project their own morals or their own shadow stuff onto what right relationships should look like. And I will say that as a person who has several identities that are outside of the norm, I come up against the most resistance when I tell people that I do non-monogamous relationships. It seems to kind of get at something that's very difficult for people to deal with. And that, has to do a lot with relationships in our society being very much about possession in some ways. And I'm just kind of speaking in simple terms for very complex content. So there's a lot going on here. But part of it has to do with how much guilt and shame are woven into the narratives we have around our bodies, around our sexuality. And part of it has to do with how possession and romantic relationship have merged. And so even though romantic relationship is a fairly new thing and marriage is a fairly new thing, we tend to take that as kind of like an innate truth. Even though what anthropology and science tell us is that humans did evolve in small, intimate groups where everything was shared. So evidence suggests that our pre-agricultural or prehistoric, because we call anything before about 10,000 years ago prehistory. So our pre-agricultural ancestors lived in groups where most mature individuals would have several ongoing sexual relationships at any given time. And so that is the bulk of our experience as a species. And so, let's see here. I don't think, so in the book, it kind of frames these kinds of relationships as casual. And I think that that's a word that's, more associated with our current society. But if we want to call them relationships, back in pre-agricultural times, they were not random or meaningless. So, healthy, vibrant sexuality with more than one person, or I should say in that time with, chimps and bonobos, it helped to keep the tension level of the tribe down. That was one of its functions. And it maintains intricate social networks as well. So there's that kind of like investment, again, in the tribe that comes through. Any questions at this point? Okay. So if we kind of start to marry this together with the evolutionary astrology paradigm, in terms of, Jeff's work in particular with sex, relationship, and human nature, what the paradigm teaches is that the purpose of relating is to encounter, experience, and move through our personal limitations. So through the act of relating, we're linked necessarily with what we need in order to transform, right? That's the basic function of Pluto, is to kind of bring us up against our pre-existing limitations, or the limitations of the desires of our ego or our Mars self, and push it through us. And so relationships are really vital to this because they demand that we look outside ourselves and listen in order to learn more about who we are, about equity and balance. And that's kind of the what I would call the highest purpose of the Libra archetype. So we create relationships with people whose nature reflects the dynamics we're defined by or working on. And we re-meet those people until those dynamics are exhausted or evolved beyond. And, the kind of like really brief summary of what's going on in the Sex at Dawn book is just to kind of start to break down the notion or the conditioning that a lot of us have that, again, the way that we are doing relationships now in terms of monogamous bonds is not necessarily natural. That doesn't mean it's bad. But my kind of bias here is just to say, yes, monogamous bonding is one absolutely valid form of relationship, but it's not the only one. And when it's set up as the only one and somebody doesn't naturally fit into that structure, it can be really, really damaging. So it gets very distorted. And so distortions of natural law, which I was using Pluto 2 a lot, but I was also using the EA glossary a lot to just kind of like pull quotes and information. So one of those quotes is, a core natural law that has been violated is the natural law of giving, sharing, and inclusion. And again, we see that kind of echo back to the science that has showed us that those, giving, sharing, inclusion were very much what those, we'll call them matriarchal cultures were based in. And I have a little bit of an aversion to the term matriarchy because I think it sets up again that polarity between like male and female, whereas I think matriarchal is more about natural law of what is right for all genders, all beings, and so on. But that's a little bit of a tangent. So the patriarchal distortions that we see here have to do with our conditioning around basic social structures, such as, the nuclear family being the ideal form of family. And again, to each their own, but the nuclear family kind of brings with it a set of problems, which include isolation, or children that don't get modeling from more than one or two models. And so that kind of contributes to a breakdown of our society. Another kind of distortion of that is that biological fatherhood is a moral imperative, and incredibly important, and that the virginity of the bride and her automatic commitment to monogamy are also moral imperatives, or just kind of givens. Like we don't question those things, or we haven't questioned those things. And so what these kind of like changes in the past, several hundred years have wrought is that the meaning of commitment and honesty have become distorted as well. So we tend to use commitment and monogamy as synonyms. So oftentimes, if I'm talking to somebody who doesn't know about non-monogamous relationships, they will say something like, well, I prefer to be committed to my partner. And I will say, I'm committed to my partners. I'm committed to a lot of my friends. I'm committed to myself. For me, commitment has to do with loyalty and honesty, but it's not just to one person. And so, that kind of gets at, again, this notion of the importance of checking your assumptions when you're working with clients, but also checking your assumptions about what the archetypes should look like or can look like. We know that archetypes can display themselves in billions of different ways. And so there's the importance of kind of just asking questions and recognizing when we're putting our own moral assumptions onto a client or onto a given archetype. And then again, as I spoke of a little bit, this kind of like under the patriarchy, marriage and coupling have had to do more with possession. And something I was thinking about earlier today was, that a lot of that I believe was seeded during the age of Taurus. We get that more possessive nature coming through, and as we enter the age of Aquarius, that seeding comes to a crisis point, right? Because it's in a square with Taurus, and so we start to see that possession and relationship and sexuality coming to the forefront, I believe. And so all of this distortion kind of leads to repressed sexual desires. It leads us to repressing our natural impulses. It has led to an incredible repression of female sexuality in general. And that often leads to guilt and shame about experiencing those desires or acknowledging that they even exist, which then leads to more kind of distortions, projection, rage, and anger in relationship. And a lot of need to control things. All right. So for the Pluto and Libra generation, and again, when we're talking about generations, we're putting things in terms of kind of like sweeping generalizations. And so it's important to keep in mind context and client experience and really look at the nodes of the moon and the rulers to kind of fill in the blanks as to what the karmic story is for an individual, and what the path might look like moving forward. But with Pluto and Libras, we're generally dealing with souls who have been in a variety of different relationships. So they're being exposed to lots of different values and belief systems. And again, that's order to kind of like learn, I am this, I am not this, I am different from this, I am the same as this. So there's that, constant compare, contrast that is going on. And so through that process, these souls have been coming to understand who they are through comparison. When we're dealing with kind of like the distortions of Pluto and Libra, and this can be a distortion and just a genuine need. There's a fundamental need to be in relationship. There's a fundamental need to work through those things and a desire to kind of like complete the self through relationship with others. So these souls are learning how to be in relationship on an equal basis. So the shadows of that, or the distortions, codependency. So these I think codependency is an issue in our culture at large, but, with the Pluto and Libras, we're talking about that being, more of a pressing issue to work through. And in a lot of ways, codependency is really tricky because it's not just a matter of like, I can't go places alone. It's a matter of clinging on to the identity of who somebody else needs you to be in order to stay with them, in order to kind of like make yourself invaluable, or bonding through relationships that are unequal. And that can happen in romantic relationships. It can happen in familial relationships. But one of the big issues is that our society has really, really romanticized codependency. We have romanticized getting lost into somebody's eyes and losing all sense of self. We have romanticized you're nobody till somebody loves you. And so there's that kind of importance placed on externalizing value, which we'll see coming through even more in the Pluto and Scorpio archetype. So more shadows of Pluto in Libra, indecisiveness or surrender of power. So there's that tendency to become too dependent on the advice and opinions of others in order to determine what to do. Indecisiveness or what's that word? Ambivalence. Kind of like, well, this sounds good, but this sounds good too, so I'm just not going to really make a decision. And that, again, is that loss of self. So that can also be just becoming so consumed with partners and their needs that the individual is getting dominated by their partner's needs, and they completely lose track of who they are, which again is just another form of imbalanced or unequal relationships. And then the other shadow is projection and conditional love. Now, again, projection is one of those things that we're all dealing with all the time. It's, we are projecting whatever is unconscious within us onto the other, and then kind of learning through that clash. The problem being that when we're not bringing a lot of consciousness to that process, we are literally associating the contents coming up from within us as being part of that other person. And so, Carl Jung would say it's our highest moral imperative to kind of reclaim those projections so that we can let other people become who they are and be who they are, and so that we can become more of who we are as well. All right. So then with the Pluto and Scorpios, we see some of those themes continued. But these are specifically souls who are desiring to transform their limitations by forming relationships to things that symbolize what they feel they need in order to evolve beyond their limitations. Okay, so there's that kind of compulsive need for transformative experiences. And this includes the transformation or merging in sex and relationships. These are souls that have been experiencing lots of situations of power and powerlessness. And so that kind of, again, forming alliances with powerful people or systems of knowledge in order to kind of like come up against their limitations and then move through them. But again, in a very externalized way. So there's a big externalization of power that's coming on here. Continual death and rebirth of awareness. And these souls, the kind of go-to here is that they tend to have a well-developed awareness of their own motivations. So they're very psychologically astute. So their own motivations, intentions, desires, and emotional patterns, which is an incredible asset, but it can also lead to a lot of manipulation, again, when there's, less consciousness involved in what's going on. And these souls are also experiencing the merging of emotional, etheric, and physical bodies through sexual union. And so there's, a lot of exchange of karma that's going on here. So we can start to kind of see how non-monogamous relationship structures could potentially create a double bind for these folks, right? There's a incredible emphasis on many lifetimes of having surrendered everything they are to relationship or to the other, loss of self, lots of, imbalanced power dynamics. And so, providing support and alliance with these people and helping them to really learn to listen to their inner voice and go through their path in whatever way they need to is really important. Any questions? All right. Oh, so the distortions of Pluto and Scorpio I kind of talked about, but these are what we would call fixated bonds, whereas the Pluto and Libra is the codependent bonds. Lots of compulsiveness, lots of externalization of power. And I covered the rest of that. So what are these souls striving towards, generally speaking? For the Pluto and Libras, they're going for the Aries polarity point, right? So learning how to initiate their own life directions without becoming too dependent on the advice of others. So there's that kind of bringing in of power, again, relocating it within the self. Learning how to be alone can be a big one. Having the courage to be alone can be a big one. Learning how to conduct relationships in new ways. So connecting with partners that will self-actualize through their own means. And this is where we bring in the term interdependence, right? So rather than being codependent, we're being interdependent. And, you know, there's a lovely image in Mark Jones' Healing the Soul that is, it's the difference between two people who are standing facing each other, kind of getting lost in each other's eyes and forgetting that there's this whole world out here that exists, or this whole world in here that exists, versus two people who are standing holding hands next to each other facing the world, right? So there's that feeling of support, but also I'm here to do something specific, and my relationships are an asset to that, but they're not something that's going to, you know, detract from that or distract me from that. So here's a quote from Patricia Walsh's Understanding Karmic Complexes. Ultimately, as we remember and heal past relational wounds, the journey back to the self happens. As we further integrate the Aries-Libra axis, self-love becomes the foundation of our ability to have healthy relations. A natural quandary of the Aries-Libra polarity that beckons us to further integration is how to have the freedom to be ourselves and still be in relationship. It takes a lifetime, even many lifetimes, to learn how to be fully yourself with another person, to be able to open and not lose your center, but also simultaneously not to be too self-focused so that others can't get in. And I thought that that quote in particular really brings in the beauty of being in harmonious relationships, which is something that, you know, I think we all strive for, but that is so difficult to attain. So then with the Pluto polarity point in Taurus, those Pluto and Scorpios are kind of striving towards choosing partners who are willing to change and grow of their own accord. They're striving for emotional self-reliance. So there's that kind of like, again, bringing it in, that emotional self-containment after so much experience externalizing power and really like reaching out in order to try to get the emotional needs met. Identification of their own values and resources, simplification and calming down, participation in committed growing relationships in non-dependent and non-compulsive ways. Excuse me. Reclaiming the need for growth as something that's not dependent on anything outside of the self. And then coming back into the body is a big one too. So reconnecting with sensuality and the physical senses. And so another quote would be, Scorpio, following Libra in the natural zodiac, has intrinsic within it already the inclusiveness of others, but needs to learn the lessons of the inner marriage, self-reliance that is based on an internal relationship with one's own soul and divine will. The inner side of Venus, the relationship to oneself, is a part of the Taurus archetype. And, you know, that brings up the kind of interesting fact that we're really just dealing here with Mars and Venus, and both of these, you know, that Libra being ruled by Venus, Aries being ruled by Mars, Scorpio being ruled traditionally by Mars, and Taurus being ruled by Venus. And so it's kind of the correcting of this distortions of those two core archetypes when we look at it in terms of planetary rulership. So let's see, where are we with time? Okay, great. I think what I'm actually going to do here is skip ahead just to look at a chart to kind of break this up a little bit, and then we'll come back to the rest of this. Although we can do this slide now. I am not an astrologer who tends to say, if you find Mars conjunct Venus in Aquarius, it's going to be a really kinky person. I don't think that's helpful. I don't think it's accurate, because you can't look at any chart and just see that that's going to be the case no matter what. But I think the most obvious correlation or correspondence that we see here, or that I've been seeing in these charts and in my own chart, is the presence of Aquarius and Uranus as being really primary archetypes in the chart. And that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of difference there. There's a lot of, liberation from conditioning, comfort or discomfort being outside the norm. And so that one's kind of a given. What I've been really interested in lately is the presence of a lot of Sagittarius in the charts that I've been working with, at least. And so the quote that I have here is, "The intent within the Sagittarius archetype is to align with natural law in order to evolve and grow past limited beliefs that are based on man-made laws." And that really just makes me think of, my really quick snapshot into the evolution of, human relationship structure and human sexuality. If we see Sagittarius as an archetype that is inherently connected to natural law, it would make sense that there is something within these souls that are coming in and exploring alternative relationship styles and alternative sexualities, having a lot of Sagittarius, because there is that kind of like connection with, this is what I want to do. This is what feels right to me. And coming back into, alignment with that. And I'm seeing that not just in individual charts, but a lot in the composite charts of non-monogamous relationships. I'm seeing Aquarius and Uranus there quite a bit too. And then something I've been exploring is the presence of Pisces there, which in terms of my own chart has been a little bit, difficult, because Pisces is so boundaryless. And when you combine that with souls who are used to, surrendering themselves to others' needs, or to the roles that others need them to play, and then you combine that with a lot of Pisces, it can be really tricky. But Pisces is in a lot of ways about detachment and letting go. And a lot of the themes that I see coming up in non-monogamous relationships is the importance of, kind of honoring when a relationship has run its course and letting it go. And then there's also, the themes of transcendent love and union, and the potential for, all to be connected, that kind of come through at the more surfacey level here, when I'm just kind of like floating these things around in my own head. Questions or comments there? It's so strange to be speaking when it's just silent.
I had a question, and you pretty much hit on what I was going to ask. It seems like a lot of what you've been talking about can come to play with the Taurus-Scorpio nodal axis, that second, eighth house, and the Aries-Libra nodal axis, and the first, seventh, people with those emphasis.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I really appreciate, what you've covered so far.
Sure. I mean, and like I said, this clearly isn't limited to just these axes, but it's just kind of the easiest to see them. And I definitely know a lot of people with Pluto and Virgo that are non-monogamous. It's just for the sake of kind of like whittling it down to further our understanding, because I tend to go big, so I need to rein it in.
Amanda, yes.
Yeah.
Could you please comment on moral assumptions that the Pluto and Sagittarius generation could be working through?
Moral assumptions that they could you say that a little bit differently?
I guess it's man-made laws, morals, ethics, in terms.
Yeah. And I guess just, what are the beliefs and what are the truths, right? So
Exactly.
what are
Yes.
What are the
yes.
beliefs that have been put onto my body, onto their bodies, in terms of, you know, what our relationships are supposed to look like, or what is true for us? And so they're really being called to kind of like work through that and learn more and be curious, right? So don't take the truths that are just given and handed to you as being absolute, but instead work with them and see what makes sense for you.
Yep, exactly. Thanks.
Right.
Hi, Amanda. Great
Yeah.
presentation. I was thinking too about the phase relationship between Mars and Venus to kind of give us an idea of where the soul is at. You know, for example, a new phase would be brand new, instinctual, and then at a balsamic, it's more, you know, they're concluding, they're wrapping up the whole cycle. So it's more of a Piscean vibe to it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think perhaps that takes some priority as well.
Yeah. And I mean, that's just, you know, taking these general themes, but then looking at the person's individual chart and taking all those little pieces of, you know, astrological technique that you know how to do in order to help them craft the questions that are going to get them onto the path that's in most alignment with their soul, rather than what you think the chart is saying or you think is right. And so then that's really helpful. And it's fascinating as astrologers to just like look at charts and talk about that stuff too. Right?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. So, like I said, I've kind of started doing research. I've been just spending time interviewing people, which has been fascinating, but I'm not ready to really do case studies about that just yet. So I figured I would just throw my chart up and tell you a little bit about my experience so you can see how these archetypes have played out somewhat for me. So South Node in Aquarius in the 7th house, right? Incredible tendency to surrender myself to the needs of others, and to be kind of different. Squared by the ruler of the South Node, Uranus in the 4th house in Scorpio. So there is a constant kind of fear of abandonment, or, you know, the rug being pulled out from under me. And also a lot of shakeup and breakdown in the family, traumatic loss in the family. And that's definitely come through in my life experience. And why I jump straight to that signature right there is because, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I've never had a monogamous relationship in my life. I've never had a conventional relationship in my life. I came into knowing about non-monogamy and polyamory about 7 years ago. So I've been practicing this for 7 years. But I have just never in my life really felt like the conventional structure of relationship was anything that would work for me. And that's for a lot of reasons. I think some of it was fear. Some of it was extreme detachment. But I go straight to that nodal axis right there, because we can see an inherent insecurity within the soul. Like there is a lot of fear, and there is a need for deep committed bonding, right? And going through non-monogamous relationships has been kind of like plunging myself into my own triggers, because there isn't the security that comes from knowing that there is one person who will always be there. I mean, that's a notion that's not necessarily true for anyone, right? But that's what we tend to kind of buy into, is that conventional, like you commit to one person and then you're going to be together forever, no matter what. And so a lot of this it has very much dredged up the deep, deep, deep Scorpio issues. And then if you look at that T-square between Saturn opposing Venus and squaring Neptune, there is the tendency for a lot of self-delusion in relationship. There is a tendency for incredible lack of boundaries and incredible lack of self. And so I thought I would just kind of pull up the chart of when I kind of discovered that there was something called polyamory and something called non-monogamy, which coincidentally was about the same month that I discovered evolutionary astrology. But what you can see here is the Saturn return is exact. So that's kind of with Uranus having just come across that Venus. So there's a lot of pressure on that T-square there in the mutable signs. And then Neptune on the South Node. And for me, finding out that there was a language for what I had kind of wanted for relationship, and finding out that there were communities was a huge homecoming in a lot of ways. And so I didn't actually enter into my first, what I would call, committed relationship. It was a non-monogamous relationship until I was 31 years old. And I say that because I have always been a really, really independent and kind of like self-contained and very I would say self-secure person. But it wasn't until I engaged in that first relationship that I really uncovered just how deeply my codependent patterns go, how deeply my need to kind of like surrender to whatever the other person needs go. And so it was kind of a shock, because I had no idea that that stuff existed. And it didn't get really, really intense until 2014, when I met somebody with whom I have a pretty major karmic history. And he entered my life right as Saturn was sitting on my IC here, you can see, right on the moon, and about to sweep through the whole karmic axis, which is when the abandonment issues really, really came to the surface. And my intention going into this transit, as I could kind of see what was coming and see the themes that would be coming up, was to get in touch with my emotional body. I had very much been living out of that Aquarian South Node. And my emotional body definitely came up, and it was a pretty harrowing time for me, with a relationship that really forced me to question what I want and need in relationship, and really getting in touch with that, which is, of course, what that North Node in the first house in Leo really needs to do. And that's, you know, what is so important about the polarity point for both of these generations is relocating wants and needs within the self. So rather than kind of like going into my third house Pluto, you know, I need to know more information. I need to know more about what he wants. I need to know more about what he needs and base everything around that. It was just cutting all of that out and saying, no, what do I want? What do I need? And one of the things that I've had said to me by many, you know, teachers, mentors, and therapists is that, you know, non-monogamous relationships for me are just kind of like exploding this karmic complex. And to some extent that has been true, but I tend to be a person who is a bit of a trial by fire type. And part of the process for me as well has been, I have to figure it out for myself. I have to go in and feel what it's like on my own. And so you can kind of see there, you know, the moon in my chart is not technically squaring the nodes. It's just kind of brought in by virtue of being close to Uranus, but it has the moon in that signature, you can see there as being, you know, it's quincunx Uranus at this time when this person came into my life. Saturn's right there. So that moon has been taking a lot of pressure. And what I've found is that the scorpionic side has really had to be transformed, and changed into something different. Any questions about that? Do you kind of see how these themes are coming through?
Yes.
Definitely.
And it's interesting that you said that you have to experience it, you know, and as we know in evolutionary astrology, we evolve through the emotional body. So it's like you're very conscious of it and you're encouraging it within yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, that is the power of this form of astrology to help people to figure out their own truth is incredible. And I honestly don't know what I would have done without the help of a couple evolutionary astrologers in this process. But it was also a matter of really opening up all of the possibilities of what the archetypes are representing and working with them and not getting too fixated on what it might mean.
And also, Amanda, there's a yod formed with your moon, the transiting Uranus, the transiting Venus, and also the transiting Saturn. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that could represent crisis and then having to make adjustments around these areas.
Right.
Yeah.
And I never really, knew how difficult it would be to locate my own wants and needs. I mean, it's still a process, but, you know, just kind of like quickly bring it up to date. There has been so much activity at that 28-degree Pisces Venus for that T-square right there, which really plays into the karmic axis way more than I thought. And last November, my progressed new moon happened at 26 degrees of Pisces. And that was the catalyst for where I am now, which is a lot more secure, a lot less attached to outcomes and people, a lot more able to be really free in my notion of what relationship should look like. And I think that that's, you know, part of my own process has been, I grew up really, really attached to the myth of soulmate, really, really into that kind of idea that there is this one person that completes you. And deconstructing that myth has been a huge process. But what I started realizing, you know, in my 20s was that I have lots of soulmates. I have lots of people that come in with whom I feel some level of charge. And one of the things I'm really committed to is figuring out what's there so that we can work through whatever we need to work through. And so for me, practicing non-monogamy isn't about, you know, dating a lot and being in a lot of relationships. I can't handle being in a lot of relationships at once. It's too intense for me, and I need to be able to focus on my work and my life. And it's too easy for me to get lost in relationship. But I need the freedom to engage with people at whatever level I want and need to engage with them whenever I want to. And so although I'm not opposed to, like, you know, being with somebody for my lifetime, I am opposed to saying I will be with you and only you for the rest of my life. Because who knows what's going to happen. And if that's what happens naturally with the person, fantastic. Family is incredibly important to me, but it has to be different, right? So there's the Uranus archetype in Scorpio in the 4th house. I need intense commitment, but I also need freedom and to do things differently.
Amanda, have you ever dealt with a partner wanting to possess you?
Well, I would say the short answer is yes, but that's where I think kink comes into play pretty well, because that's that kind of like consensual play where we can get that need met. So it's that kind of like, I've had a partner say to me before, like, for the next 3 hours, can we just pretend like we're monogamous? And I'm like, sure, that sounds great. Right? Or it is just very much having like open conversations about those urges. I've had the urge for somebody to possess me, right? But I tend to kind of like act it out in the bedroom in very consensual and negotiated ways instead of, you know, having it be super unconscious. I mean, I did in my early 20s, I had a relationship with somebody, a non-relationship relationship. It was weird, with somebody who was very possessive. And part of me was really, really attracted to that. But I also didn't trust it. So it didn't really go anywhere.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. I can't really see. Is your Venus retrograde?
It's not.
Okay.
No, all the retrogrades are on the other side of the chart.
I gotcha. Because there is an element, you know, with Venus retrograde to that Uranian archetype with the relationship wise. So I thought maybe.
Yeah, and it is trine Uranus. So they're working together there. Any other questions about my chart?
How do you feel about the exchange of karma through sexual fluids?
Yeah, that's a big one. I think that's very real. That is a notion that I had a lot of resistance to. A lot of resistance that I've had to examine really closely. I think that that's real. I think it's something for anybody who's kind of working on bringing more consciousness to their lives to be really aware of. I have several friends who have kind of reframed it for me in several ways, because at first I was just like, man, that's a bummer, because, when I came into non-monogamy, the saying at first was, it's not all about the sex. And I was like, okay, it's not all about the sex. But I've come to kind of reclaim that sexual diversity and maintaining the kind of sexual experiences that I want and can't get with every single partner is a huge part of why I do this. And so that's a tricky aspect. But, like one of my friends pointed out, she said, Pluto and Libra, Pluto and Scorpio working through and burning off karma like crazy. And so with a lot of conscious awareness brought to that process, merging sexually and sharing sexual fluids, there is the potential to transmute a lot of karma. I don't know where I am thinking about that at this point in my life. I'm definitely just kind of learning as much as I can through my own experience, and being aware that it is trickier for me, being a really sensitive person, having multiple partners who then might or might not have multiple partners as well.
Apparently we can transmute the exchange of karma through the strength of will, and I'm looking at your Pluto polarity point in Aries in the 9th house.
Yeah.
So are you aware of that?
Am I aware of transmuting through the strength of will? I have become...
Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
I have become more aware of it, and also more aware of, there's some people's karma that I really just don't want to transmute. And so setting up boundaries there.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, another thing that comes to mind there as I'm looking at that Pluto polarity point is I can hear someone's voice in my head saying, it's about singularity. It's about choosing just one. And that's echoed right in the North Node in the 1st house, that kind of like focus and commitment. And there's a lot of paradox going on there, right? And so that gets into what I was saying kind of earlier in the presentation, where there is that potential for these relationship styles to really stir up a lot of the karma and force people in on the complexes and possibly, just redoing them. And so, go ahead.
With the Aries polarity point, I also see, having the freedom to initiate whenever you want to.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's why I sometimes just say, I do what I want.
Exactly. Because Aries is all about your journey, tapping into your own awareness, and having that freedom to not getting stuck so you can keep going.
Right. And so for me, what some of the things that these relationship styles have done for me that have been really positive is, through networking and talking to people, it really gives me a way to focus on my own experience, to see myself as my own primary partner. But it's also, there's a very limited pool of people that I can go to for advice, right? So I have to figure these things out for myself a lot of the time. One of the really incredible things that I have been a part of and that I see in Seattle where I live is that there's a huge non-monogamous community, and these are all people who are engaging relationships that don't have models, right? And so what we do is just kind of like have open spaces where we can talk about what we're going through, knowing that nobody's going to have any kind of like prescriptive advice, because there is such a lack of structure or model. But we can say, like, I've been in a situation that was somewhat similar to this, and this is what I did. And so there is, again, that kind of focus on the individual figuring out their own way, finding their own truth, finding their own needs, but then also having that social network, right? And the relationship with others that are kind of like supporting and helping through it, regardless of what's going on or whether or not they know what the right answer is.
Yeah. Following your intuitive impulses comes to mind too. With
Yes.
that
Right. And that's, so there's a lot of wounding there around so many lifetimes of surrendering needs to others. Reestablishing my connection with my intuition has been fairly brutal. And I know that I'm not alone in that. That's the common thing that comes into my consulting room. But commitment to that path is probably one of my highest priorities. Commitment to really, really leaning into my intuition and learning how it speaks to me and learning how to trust it is massive. And I am so grateful to have evolutionary astrology to help me kind of like figure out that that's what I need to do, because I really do need to do that. All right. So some of the kind of like roundup, some of the things that I've pulled out of the interviews that I've done with people are going to be in the next 2 slides. And so when they give their reasons for non-monogamy, and right now the people that I've been interviewing are really, really active in these communities. And so they have a really good, framework for understanding these things and a really good language. But the things that I pulled out of it is that they are in non-monogamous relationships because they want to stay open to relationships. So that's one of the things that I had mentioned for myself. They're very invested in building intentional families. These are a lot of people who have been outcast from their families, not just because of their relationship choices, but because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And so they really understand the importance of establishing support systems and support networks. The desire for sexual diversity comes up over and over again. So people, liking the experience of exploring a new body or exploring other people's bodies or getting to know themselves and their own bodies through their interactions with different people. Sexual incompatibility is a big one. So if 2 people come together and they have an incredible relationship, but their libidos are mismatched, for example, why should they have to end the relationship? Just so that the one with the higher libido can get their needs met, for example. A need to refrain from prioritizing sexual relationships over non-sexual ones is big, and that's really big in the relationship anarchy community. So this is the kind of idea that our platonic relationships or our, intimate friendships can be just as important as our sexual romantic relationships. Non-monogamous relationships often give them the space or freedom to be themselves. So there tends to be a high emphasis on personal autonomy as being kind of like core values in a lot of the relationships of people that I've been talking to. Not wanting to be limited. Definitely questioning the notion that one person can or should provide everything you need. So again, I think some of this is wisdom that's applicable to any kind of relationship. It's like that you're in a monogamous marriage, but you have your friendships that provide things that you want, like somebody to watch cheesy romantic movies with, or somebody to go golfing with, or whatever the case may be. Your partner can't provide everything for you, or should they? And so again, there's that focus on the re-internalization of the needs. A lot of people say, I can't not be this way. It forces one to explore tendencies towards people pleasing and independence and codependency patterns. So these are the people who are kind of like really saying, hey, I have these codependency patterns and I want out of it. And so I'm really like, I'm really forcing myself into it. So then again, we see this marriage of like lots of relationship, but lots of personal autonomy. And then a dislike of the isolation experienced in monogamy. So then the values that I'm seeing echoed in people in terms of like, what are the core values of their relationship? In my communities, this is not true across the board, but a lot of non-monogamous people will have like relationship agreements that are based on a set of like core values. So assuming best intentions, not assuming that your partner is trying to manipulate you, not assuming, up the front that they not being suspicious. So assuming that they have your best interests in mind first. Navigating difficult life stuff as a unit. I will say that as I have developed community here in Seattle, I have never felt so supported in so many ways in my life. And it's a really incredible thing for somebody who has a really, really core feeling of being constantly alone. Sex positivity and body positivity are definitely values that come up again and again. The importance of community. So being open about conflict and being comfortable in conflict, I thought that was interesting to see coming up again and again, especially for the Pluto and Libras, who tend to like politeness. And that's what several of the people I interviewed were talking about, was that they always just want everyone to be happy and they always want to be nice. And one of the things they're learning is, especially in community situations, like I was interviewing a group of 3 individuals who all live together and have various relationship dynamics. and they were talking about how amazing it is to be okay when one of the partnerships is fighting or in tension, and to not trying to diffuse it, and to not try to like make everything okay. Authenticity is a huge value. Expectation of growth and change. So knowing that the relationships will grow and evolve just as each individual in the relationship does. Intentionality, questioning assumptions, moving from either or to both and. So saying like, you don't have to choose. Like I've had several people say to me, you have to choose between home and security or non-monogamous relationships, or you have to choose between relationship or your job. And I'm like, no, I want all of that. And then the need to take care of self. So in terms of best practices for counseling astrologers, asking questions is always going to be at the top of my list, regardless of what topic we're discussing. But it is questioning your assumptions about if somebody comes in and they are discussing their relationship, is it a monogamous relationship? What is the relationship structure? Or if somebody says something like, I'm in a polyamorous relationship, or I'm queer, asking them what that means to them. Okay, and so part of that is to just get a better understanding, and again, to keep checking your own assumptions, but part of that is also to, use the same language as the client is using. So use their self-chosen identity labels or relationship labels. And then helping the client to check their own assumptions too. So how or why did you come to be involved in monogamy or polyamory? Again, it's that, people sometimes don't know that there's a choice. Right? And so helping them to get at the root of why or how they've become involved in something is going to help them to kind of like navigate the path a little bit more clearly. And the other thing that kind of comes up there is, I just lost that thought. So then I also have here, remember that relationship difficulties are not an issue of monogamy versus non-monogamy. They're a product of our culture and based on individual experience. So refraining from judgments. I was in therapy with somebody once, and I was talking about my relationship where I was in a relationship with a man, and he had 2 other partners at the time. And my therapist kept saying, oh, I could never do that. I have no idea how he does that. I just can't imagine having that. And it just wasn't helpful to me. So again, it's that kind of like keeping your own judgments in check. And there's probably a lot of information there for you to work through. And then just using the chart. One of the examples that I was thinking about was, we can make assumptions about certain things. Like if you see Taurus on the 7th house cusp, or you see Venus in Taurus or Venus in Mars, there's a pretty good chance that person might be a little bit more conservative around their relationships. And there's a pretty good chance that they might really need stability and structure. So that's not, or security. And that's not to say that, alternative relationship styles don't supply that. But again, it's just asking the person, why are you participating in non-monogamous relationships? And they might say, because I feel like it's my soul's calling. Or they might say, it's because what all my friends are doing. Okay. And so then that answer kind of gives you more to go on. So then it's working into, what do they need in relationship? Well, I need security. I need somebody who focuses on me or prioritizes me. Okay, is that what your current relationships look like? And then just kind of going from there. And then my last note here is, personal experience. I would say, especially with the Pluto and Libras, or anyone with heavy, Libra, Gemini in their nodal axis, watch for the ways that they rationalize. Watch for the ways that they kind of like talk themselves into making things okay. And another way that you can do that, or a way that you can help them with that, is to bring it into body. So if they're saying, well, I know that, non-monogamy is really great because it helps you to focus on self and personal autonomy, you can say, stop for a minute, take a deep breath. When you think about your relationship, how do you feel? Well, I feel like it's really tight in my chest. Okay, what is that? It's anxiety. Okay, what's behind the root of that anxiety? And so it's, I would say with the Taurus archetype, it is just bringing it into that simplified place. What is body saying, and how is body relating to this experience? All right. So I think I'm going to go straight to the resources here. I just have a couple, but relationshipanarchy.com is pretty cool because it has a bunch of really quick 2 to 3 minute videos that will break down some of these concepts into more metabolizable parts. Morethan2.com is kind of a go-to resource in the community for information. Solopoly.net is pretty great. There are free PDFs of Sex at Dawn all over the internet, so you can kind of Google that and find one if that's something you're interested in. And then I'm always happy to chat about this stuff. Email is best for me. And so other than that, any other questions, comments about any of this stuff? All right.
Amanda, I really appreciate your being open and speaking up and doing this, because it's really, I find it very interesting, and especially in light of Pluto and Libra and Scorpio generations. Thank you.
You're welcome. I was thinking this morning, the first time I went to a intensive about synastry, where I was learning about synastry charts for like 4 days, I sat down and the person who was leading the course started talking about, the grand scheme of the universe, everything that the whole universe is evolving towards is the 2-star system. And the 2-star system is the most common star system in our universe. And that's, a metaphor for what relationships need to look like. 2 stars orbiting each other. And it really triggered me. And I had to really work through what was coming up. Like, am I just being defensive? Is this my truth? Blah, blah, blah. But it was so subtly presented as this kind of like, hierarchical evolutionary bent that I think can be really harmful. And so I've been wanting to just, talk about this stuff more in astrological communities so that we can use astrology as a gift that helps people on their own paths, rather than having our assumptions kind of like control the session.
Excellent. Well put. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Amanda, could you please click on stop share?
Sure.
And take us back to the panel. And what advice could you give with the nodes now in Leo and Aquarius? Are you seeing any changes happening, or?
I think the nodes in Leo and Aquarius gives us a really incredible opportunity to help people celebrate their individuality and their own paths, right? But it also helps us to build the bridge between community and the collective and the individual. So, in terms of alternative relationship styles, it is just that kind of empowering people to be the unique spark of light that they are in whatever way that comes forward. But it also just keeps, pinging my mind in the transition into the age of Aquarius, the importance of, what we're going to learn in the next 18 months about that axis really comes to the forefront, right? And so what that brings to mind there is, for me, figuring out how to relate in healthier ways is absolutely imperative to the health of the collective, right? And we get there through helping each person get in touch with who they really are so that they can be in more interdependent relationships. So I don't know that in the past, month or so since that shift has happened, I've seen a change in terms of my clients just yet and what they're talking about. But it is that kind of, the Leo creative self-actualization. Where are they at, and how can I help them be empowered to get to where they need to go?
Yeah, like it is taught in EA that a Leo person who's not getting their need for, you know, love and attention can go out and then have an affair with somebody.
Right.
You know, any comments on that?
Yeah, so, you know, what I have done is I've kind of recognized my own Leo need to be seen and to be recognized for who I am. The way that that's played out in non-monogamous relationships is I'm not saying I need to be the only one. I'm just saying it's one of my needs from my partners is to have them acknowledge how I am special to them, what they value about me, because I do need to feel seen. That is a really important part of all my relationships, be they romantic or platonic. And so again, it's just that kind of getting in touch with the fact that that is a need and then being able to express it.
Great, thank you. And any questions from anybody?
I just wanted to make a comment to, I agree with Sue's sentiments on, I really appreciate your sharing a lot of your story, though it really has helped me see, because the Taurus Scorpio polarity and the Aries Libra polarity is quite prevalent in my chart, and it really has helped me look at it from a different way. So thank you. I really appreciate that, and I wanted you to know that.
You're welcome. Thanks for letting me know, and thanks for hanging out.
Do you think all the generations, you know, have to deal with these issues, not just the Libra and Scorpio generations, because I feel that the Leo generation has been dealing with these issues for a long time as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. I mean, and the Pluto and Leos were coming of age when this kind of like non-monogamous counterculture experiment came to the forefront last time, right, in the 60s. I think for me, the difference, I don't know if it's a difference, but, you know, the kind of exclamation point is the Pluto and Libras especially are kind of like running out of time to be the change. Like, we need these younger generations to really get their shit together and come into their own and then start actively initiating change in the world. Right. And so that's when I tend to just be like, okay, come and let's work these things out. And that's, I mean, that's, I get people of all ages in my session room, but the Pluto and Libras, Pluto and Scorpios, Pluto and Sagittarius who are trying to like really, really work things out quickly are the ones that inspire me and the ones that make me really committed to holding spaces where they can do that. But yes, it is an intergenerational issue for sure.
And so we're teaching these newer generations, the younger generations, about natural law. So
Yeah.
could you sum up on, you know, what is natural sexuality and relationships?
Well, you know, I think what I talked about there is that, you know, emphasis on giving, sharing, and inclusion, as opposed to, you know, hoarding and making things into private possession, right?
Mm.
That's kind of like the basic level of it. You know, one of the things we always talk about in the polyamorous community is that love is infinite, right? Time is not infinite, but love is infinite. And it's not something like you love all of your children, right? You have a lot of love in you that you can give to more than one person. I mean, I love very freely and very openly, and that goes to my romantic partners and my platonic friendships as well. And to me, that feels more in alignment with natural law than anything else. But again, that natural law is also bringing in what is the wisdom of the body? What is the body saying? How do we reconnect to our intuition, and how do we reconnect to the natural cycles of the earth and the seasons and all of those things, so that we're working in harmony with the quote unquote forces of nature, and using that, you know, really fantastic Capricorn energy to kind of like put that into our structures and institutions, rather than all of the distortions that we currently have.
That's great. Very helpful. Thank you very much. And any final questions or comments, and then we'll wind down. Okay. Thank you
All
so
right.
much, Amanda. And would you all please thank Amanda?
Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you, Amanda. That was,
Amanda, thank you. You did a really awesome job.
it
Thank you.
was.
Thank you so
Fantastic.
much.
Very
Anytime.
helpful. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.